Like Haley said, my name is Dwayne Joseph. I'm the ag extension agent up in Kent County. My talk is going to be kind of putting two things that are not really related together. I guess they both start with so I guess that's the closest when it comes to relation. But I'm going to tie it up in the end where I kind of bring them both together. So we're going to talk about cover crops and composting. And so this is a required slide by the University of Maryland. So basically what this is saying is that, we don't discriminate on any basis, race, color, sex, gender. And if there's any issues, if anybody feels discriminated, there's a way to file a complaint. So our talk today is just going to go over, like I said, composting, also cover crops. And then if we have some time at the end, this is basically how the talk is going to go. Composting, cover crops, and then if we have any questions at the end, if we have time, I'll be able to take those. So first of all, let's go over composting, right? So I guess everybody is kind of familiar a little bit about composting. So when you ask yourself, what is compost, right? So compost is basically decaying organic material, right? So when you look at the act of composting is basically the conversion of organic matter into nutrient rich soil, and that's what we call compost. So there might be some issues or some discrepancies when people think of compost and humus, right? Just to clarify, compost is the halfway decomposed organic matter, whereas humus is the fully decomposed matter. And when it comes to humus, it's a little bit more stable. You could kind of think of it like, humus is like the adult form of composting, and compost is kind of like the adolescent, the kind of halfway in between. Both of these are really great for soil health. But like I said earlier, humus is a little bit more advanced and it lasts a little longer in the soil. How did these occur in nature, right? Things die, they decompose, animals basically they poop, they waste or they die. Leaves, twigs, all of these fall from trees, they fall on the ground, they get wet, they heat up, they decompose, earthworms, different organisms in the soil, all decomposing. So this is how this basically occurs in nature. And what we're trying to do with composting is kind of mimic that, right? In a controlled environment. Like the earlier slide said, kind of just to go a little more in depth. So soil organisms, they decompose this organic matter. Bacteria, termites, like I said earlier, also earthworms. All of these contribute to the decomposition of organic matter in nature. So when we look at compost we have a lot of benefits of compost, right? It's able to suppress plant diseases and also plant pests. It's also able to reduce or eliminate the need for synthetic and chemical fertilizer. Although compost is not as high in, N, P, and K, those macronutrients that plants need, especially versus if we look at like a synthetic fertilizer, but it's also able to, provide and be a good source of those plant nutrients. Also, it's cost effective, and it's a good way to remediate soils that was contaminated by different biohazards or also hazardous waste. So when it comes to composting, there are two main types to compost, right? Either you do it aerobically, and that's in the presence of oxygen, or anaerobically, and that's in the absence of oxygen. And we're going to break those two processes down a little bit more in our upcoming slides. So when you look at anaerobic composting, it's basically the process of decomposing organic matter without the presence of oxygen. So like the name suggests, anaerobic, that means without the presence of oxygen. When it comes to anaerobic composting, it's a little slower than aerobic composting. And it often occurs in sealed containers, right? So if you think of oxygen deficient environment, like you tie up a bag, you seal a container also under water. places where, you won't find much oxygen. And that's where that anaerobic composting basically takes place. So one issue with anaerobic composting, as you would imagine, if something is sealed up, is a smell, right? That smell is basically caused by hydrogen sulfide, and that's, released from those decaying organisms. Um, if I don't know if any of you guys have smelled rotten eggs before, that kind of sulfuric type smell, that's what you're gonna get. You know, it's always good to be able to, do composting and be able to do these different types of methods when it comes to soil health, but there's also always some drawbacks. So with anaerobic composting, there's that issue of smell. Also, there's a smell with aerobic, but not as strong as with the anaerobic composting. So just some basics. If you want to, start, an anaerobic compost. First, you could get some grass clippings, especially now. When I left home, I saw my neighbors were cutting their grass. You could go out in your yard, cut your grass, take those clippings. You put those in like the 30 or 40 gallon size trash bag. At least you want those to be at least 3 millimeters wide. Thick, sorry. And the bag should be able to hold about 3 bushels of organic matter in it. So you have your clippings, you put it in your bag, and then guess what we get? We get that smell, right? But then if you get past that smell, after when everything is all decomposed and nice, you get some nice, good compost that you could use in your yard. So just to kind of go through this with a little bit more detail. So you get some grass clippings from your yard. You would add about a shovel full of soil, and that's going into that bag, that trash bag I spoke about, 30 or 40 gallon size trash bag. You add a little water in there to get everything started. And then you also want to add some a handful of about a handful of nitrogen fertilizer. And that's, just to give it some of that nutrients that your plant would eventually need after your compost is ready. Then you close your bag tightly. You give it a good shake so everything could get mixed up. The soil would get mixed with the water and the grass. And you'd want to leave it out for about 6 to 12 months, right? You want to also flip the bag periodically to redistribute the contents and also to incorporate that whatever air is in there. You want to be able to, give it a good shake and leave it for about 6 to 12 months. Like I said, we might remembering to always flip it around just to get everything all mixed up. Then you'd want to set that bag in a sunny spot, especially out in the summer. You want to put it out somewhere where it can get some heat because that would be the main catalyst to get all the the microorganisms and basically get everything started. If it's winter time, you'd want to probably move it to your garage or your basement where it could get some heat. Like with anything, when it's cold, microorganisms slow down. So you want to keep things nice and warm so that it decomposes properly. Something you want to also remember, like I said, it takes about 6 to 12 months. So you want to remember to be patient because it's a process, it takes time. So put it somewhere, forget about it, and then come back in 6 to 12 months to see how far along it is. So let's switch to aerobic composting. So like the name suggests, aerobic compost depends on oxygen microorganisms. And these microorganisms use oxygen to help them feed on organic matter and also break down that organic matter into simpler compounds. When it comes to aerobic composting, the process generates heat, and that supports the growth of more microorganisms, right? And that kind of process is what accelerates the decomposition process, and it transforms the organic waste to compost. The main difference between the two is aerobic, you have those oxygen-dependent microorganisms. Anaerobic, you have it in a sealed bag, no oxygen, being introduced into it. So some of the basics when it comes to aerobic compost, and we're going to break each of these topics down a little bit more as we go through the slides. You ask yourself, what materials do you need, right? Also, you ask yourself, what does the compost need? And you ask, what can you compost? And then we'll also go through stuff that you should not be putting in your compost pile. So what materials do you need? So first you need a compost bin, right? You need somewhere to put your compost also, or you could have it either in a bin or in a pile. We'll go for that later. But when you use a bin, it can be a simple homemade bin, or you can make it out of fence, as you see in the upper right picture over there. You could also use garbage cans. That could be a good place. Just make sure to put holes in there so it could get some oxygen. And also you could purchase bins in the store. Also you could make them out of like shipping pallets. There are many creative ways when it comes to producing or making a compost bin. Another system a lot of people use is having more than one bin. And that's good when it comes to, if you continually add into your compost. So you'd have compost at different stages, right? So you're not just relying on just, one instance of starting a compost and then you wait 6 months. If you stagger it in multiple bins, then, you'll be able to use your compost throughout your season, throughout the year. When it comes to using piles, if you don't want to use a bin, you could also use a compost pile. When it comes to a pile, you want to stick to about 3 feet wide by 3 feet long and also 3 feet high, so 3 by 3 by 3. And the reason for that is that you want it to be able to be easy to flip, right? You want to be able to you alone or probably you and somebody else. You want it to be manageable, basically. So keep it to a size that is not too big. If it's too big, it'll take too long to compost. If it's too small, you might lose a lot of it on the edges and stuff. So you want to keep a nice size pile. You want to remember to turn it. If you stop turning it, it will still compost, but it will just do it at a really slower rate. So you want to be able to remember to continue turning. So when it comes to setting up your bin, you want to choose a location where you have some water, right? You want to add water to that. Those microorganisms need water to decompose. Also, you want to keep it in a sunny spot. Like I said, with the anaerobic composting, where that heat is what, is a catalyst for those microorganisms to work. You want to keep it also preferably in a sunny area. So when we look at the recipe, we have 4 main components of a good aerobic compost pile, right? We have brown stuff, green stuff, water, and air. And we're going to break each of those down in the upcoming slides, what exactly they are. So what is the brown stuff? So brown stuff is basically, like the name says, is anything that's dead, right? Anything that's brown. So dried plant parts, leaves, pine needles. And the brown stuff is basically your carbon source. So the brown stuff is high in carbon. When you look at the green stuff, that's like the fresh stuff. So living parts of grass clippings, vegetable scraps from your kitchen, plant materials. And these materials are your nitrogen source. So these will be high in nitrogen. And again, water, like I said, you need to feed those microorganisms. And, either from rain or from a hose, they don't know water is water. So you want to also be able to have that water in there. So when it comes to decomposition, particle size has an impact, right? You don't want to put nothing that's too big because it will take too long to decompose. So if you're using your brown stuff, if you're using dried up leaves, you might want to, grind it up, mulch it, run a lawnmower over it first, get it nice and small so you could add it to your pile. And that would reduce basically the length of your decomposition. Also, aeration is also important because those microorganisms use oxygen. We need to be able to have oxygen flow through the pile, right? And a good way to do that is having the different size of materials. You have coarse materials, you have bigger materials and smaller materials. So you have those voids in between. You don't want to have all big materials because it's going to take a little longer to decompose. And you don't want all small materials because you want to be able to have those air spaces for air to get in. So you need both and you need to have a good ratio of the two. So when it comes to the green stuff versus the brown stuff, um, a good ratio is always a 30-1 brown to green, right? So you want to have 30 parts of brown stuff or carbon source versus 1 part of your nitrogen source. And that ratio would give you you know, the best decomposition time. So basically you want more of this on the left than your food scraps that we see on the right.
Okay.
So with composting, any ratio will fully eventually compost. But you know, if you want it quicker, if you want it done quicker, it's better to stick with that 30-1 ratio, and that would give you the best time when it comes to decomposition. So some things not to add to your compost pile. So you don't want to add any meat or milk products, right? And that's basically because you want to keep those critters out of your pile or out of your bins. I don't know about you, but you know, where I live, we have some raccoons, we have a lot of unwelcome guests, squirrels that just want to, you know, go through whatever you leave outside, whatever food source. So you want to be careful when it comes to what you add into that pile to keep those guys away from it. Also, another thing you want to keep out of your compost pile is disease plants, and that's for obvious reasons. You don't want to introduce any disease into your garden later on in the season. Even though compost, you know, is pretty good at when it heats up, pretty good at, you know, controlling and killing different pathogens, but you don't want to take the risk, right? You don't want to have that risk. So you want to be able to stay away from putting any diseased plants in there. Also noxious weeds, especially those with seeds. Myself, as I'm a weed scientist, we always want people to, you know, be cautious when it comes to weed seed. Um, you know, compost has been shown to be able to inactivate weed seed, but again, you don't want to take that risk, right? Depending on the size of the seed, you know, some seeds be able to, you know, withstand the heat that's generated in composting, and you don't want to introduce those into your garden later on in the season. Also, you want to stay away from stolons in your from weeds in your pile, and what these are basically the below ground parts of vegetatively reproducing plants. So basically those roots that would basically generate a new plant. So you don't want these in your pile, and again, that's for obvious reasons. Another thing you want to add in there, cooking oils, grease, also bones. These take a long time to decompose, so you don't want those in there. And also you don't want to put any pet droppings or pet manure in there, and that's mainly for biohazard. You want to, you know, take away any biohazard risks. You don't want to, you know, spread those in your garden. So stay away from basically any of those pet manures, bones, or cooking oils or greases. So now you have all your stuff in your pile. What do you do with it, right? You always need to remember to keep turning your pile, because turning it is important, because, you know, turning it, you'll be able to, you know, get stuff from the bottom, flip it to the top, stuff on the side, get them in the middle. So everything will be able to be mixed evenly. If it smells, turn it. Your pile should be ideally turned about once a week, and that would give you the best results. So you keep turning your pile. You know, you're looking at the clock. You need to start growing your plants. You need to start, you know, putting stuff in your garden. So you're wondering, you know, how long does it take? How long does this process take? It all depends, right? Like I said, Depends on the size of the materials you put in there, what type of materials you put in there, how much air it gets, how much heat. So it's a bunch of variables. So there's not a set time that I could give you that it would take. Um, but once all the materials are consumed, then you know for sure that it's done, right? So if you stick to, all those best management practices, you turn it, keep it in a warm place, you give it water. It should be ready when you see that pile kind of shrink all the way down. So how do you know when it's done? When it's cool. So when it's not hot anymore, it's basically cooled down, then like okay, it's there. Also when it comes to appearance, the finished compost will look dark and crumbly, so it kind of look like soil, so you want to look for that. Also you want to look for the texture. Is it uniform? So finished compost, the texture is all uniform. Also, you shouldn't be able to recognize any of the original items that you put in there, right? So if you put any banana peels or potato or peppers or whatever plants, you're not supposed to be able to recognize those. And also another good way to know if it's done is if you find earthworms at the bottom of your pile, and that would show that they went through the top, they went through the whole pile, and now they're at the bottom. So these are just little rules of thumb when it comes to figuring out when your pile is done. So now your pile is done. What do you do with your compost, right? So, and also why do you want to use compost? So one is it increases soil moisture holding capacity. You wouldn't have to water your soil as much when you have compost. Also, it adds organic matter. I mean, it also enhances your soil's capacity to retain those NPK, those are essential nutrients, right? It also contains important micronutrients that you won't be able to find. You won't be able to find those synthetically, those micronutrients, or they'll be hard to find synthetically. So having a compost is good when it comes to providing your plants with those essential those micronutrients. And also it may suppress some diseases, right? So if you look at in grapes and roses, crown gall, having a compost has been shown to suppress those diseases. So some application rates when it comes to using your compost is if you're looking to establish some new grass, you want to put about a 1 to 2 inches down. Just for routine lawn maintenance, you want to put an eighth to a half an inch of compost in there. You planting you planting in the spring, you have some new beds you're trying to prepare, you want to put down about 1 to 2 inches of compost. You're planting any trees in your backfill soil, you want to put about a third of that, you want to have that as compost. So this is another way that you could use compost, and that's by making what's called a compost tea. And that's for obvious reasons. If you look in this picture here, it kind of looks like, you dip in a tea bag. Also the color is kind of, looks like tea. And the way you go ahead and make that is by, you take your finished compost, you put it in a burlap bag, something that's porous, so that basically, because you're trying to mimic tea, right? So you put it into something that's porous. You soak it in a trash can or in a barrel or in anything filled with water. And you let everything drip out of that compost. You soak it for several days. You remember to keep on stirring it to get as much out of the compost as you can. And then when your tea is done, it'll be nice and brown, and you could use it to water your plants. It's also high in microbes, so it's really good when it comes to, adding to soil and health. So, and that's a good way of using your compost also in your garden. So just to go over some scenarios, when you would use aerobic composting versus when you would use anaerobic composting, right? Because you might be asking yourself, which one should I use? I explained both. You're like, okay, Dwayne, which one works for me? So you want to ask yourself these questions, right? Do you have enough space and resources to regularly turn and aerate, right? So when it comes to aerobic composting, you'd want to have enough space. It's really space dependent. So if you have enough space, you maybe would want to go with aerobic composting. When you want your decomposition to go faster, you're like, hey, I don't have time. You want to go the aerobic route. When odor control is important, you don't want your place, your neighbors, your HOA, you get a letter from your HOA. Um, you want to be able to, keep those smells down. Aerobic composting might be the way to go. If you want to go the anaerobic route, you'd basically have limited space or resources for composting. So you don't have enough space, you might want to go the anaerobic route. When you want to also do composting indoors, you may want to choose anaerobic. When you're looking for a low maintenance composting method, you don't want to turn a pile, you have back issues, you may want to use anaerobic composting. And finally, if when you're composting materials that are very difficult to break down, so like let's say meat or dairy products, you might want to go anaerobic. Okay, so that was enough on composting. Let's quickly, just with whatever time is left, go through some cover crops. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with cover crops, but so I'm gonna approach this as you guys have a little limited knowledge on cover crop. So what basically is a cover crop, right? So technically, cover crop is just a plant that is grown to protect the soil or also improve the soil rather than for harvest, right? So typically you don't harvest the cover crop, you just plant it for different, whatever soil improvement abilities it offers and also weed suppression. So when it comes to cover crops, they're basically planted in the off season or between the main crops. So again, a couple slides down, we're gonna kind of delve into the different types of cover crops and the different ways which we could use cover crops. So you might ask yourself, or you might ask me, Dwayne, why should I grow a cover crop? Like, why should I waste money to grow a cover crop when I'm not even going to harvest it, or I can't even eat it, right? So one, it prevents soil erosion, right? So especially in the off season, especially in the winter, you wanted something to cover your soil, right? Especially if you're in raised beds, you don't want the rain to come, you don't want the wind to blow, it's normally windy in Maryland. You don't want to lose your soil. So by putting a cover crop in there, it basically protects your soil and prevents it from erosion. Also, it suppresses weeds. Like I said earlier, I'm a weed scientist, so I had to put that in there. We've been doing a lot of work with cover crops to see how it could suppress weeds. And they're really good at suppressing weeds. So that's another benefit of using cover crops. Also they enhance soil fertility. They promote beneficial soil microorganisms. Again, they contribute to soil health. And if you're growing any plants or if you just, like pollinators, they're really good at attracting pollinators and beneficial insects. So if in the summers, you grow a lot of vegetables, they need to be pollinated, you may want to have those pollinators in your yard. So you may want to attract them with some cover crops. So cover crops can be managed two different ways, right? So you could either have them as a living mulch, which is shown here on the left. You could see, and what a living mulch is basically a cover crop that you interplant with your cash crop or whatever you're gonna harvest. And it just lives throughout the growing season with your cash crop in it for these soil health benefits and also for weed suppression. Also, you could use it as a dying mulch, which needs to be terminated or killed. With a dying mulch, what you still get that soil health benefit, but also you get that residue on the soil that will be able to suppress weeds and other stuff from germinating. So when it comes to cover crops, there are three main types or three main groups or families, I should say, of cover crops, right? So first we have legumes. And these would be those nitrogen fixers. So think of stuff like vetch, clovers, peas, beans. Then you'd have your grass or your cereals. So these could be, cereal rye, oats, wheat, barley. And finally, we have brassicas, and these would be your radishes, canola, mustards. So you could either plant these by themselves or you can plant them in a mix. And each has different benefits, which we'll go through in the next couple of slides. So they're all beneficial, these planting these different types of cover crops. So you have decided that you want to try cover cropping, right? But you just don't know where to start. So it's always good to ask yourself these 4 questions, and that would help you kind of make a better educated decision on the process of cover cropping. So the first question you'd want to ask yourself is, what is your goal for cover cropping, right? So what exactly do you want to get out of growing those cover crops? Excuse me. Secondly, you want to ask yourself, what cash crop will I follow the cover crop with, right? So what am I going to put in there? Am I going to put tomatoes, peppers, squash, watermelon, whatever? You need to ask yourself, what am I going to put after I get rid of those cover crops? Then you need to ask yourself, how are you going to establish the cover crop, right? And establish, I mean, how are you going to plant it, basically? And then finally, you want to ask yourself, how are you going to terminate the cover crop? Terminate, a fancy word for kill. So how are you going to get rid of that cover crop in your field or in your backyard? Then you ask yourself, what are your goals for your cover crop, right? So let's say you have compacted soil. So brassicas are really good for compacted soil. So a radish, a tillage radish, forage radish would be good. Canola or rapeseed, also mustards are really good at breaking up compacted soil and giving you, in the spring, giving you a nice seed bed to work with. Also, when it comes to biofumigation, mustards are really good at, biofumigating soils. So you'd basically till those under, and they have certain processes, certain chemicals in them that are good when it comes to remediating soil. So let's say you have a nitrogen deficient soil, right? You need some nitrogen in your soils. So legumes are really good cover crops to plant, right? You could put some peas, beans. What we personally use a lot is clovers, white, red, crimson, all different types of clovers. Also vetch. So these legumes basically, grab nitrogen out of the air, fix it in the nodules that they have in their roots, and they make that nitrogen available in your soil. So, if you want to fix nitrogen, might want to get some legumes, leguminous cover crops in there. Weed suppression. If you have weeds, you want to suppress those weeds and control those weeds. Cereals or grasses are really good at that, right? And the main driver with them controlling weeds is basically the biomass, right? Wheat, barley, oats, they put out a lot of biomass. And after you terminate, you could put it down as a mulch, leave it on the soil, and it would be able to control those weeds. Also, if you look at cereal rye, it has allelopathic tendencies, and what that is that they release some phytochemicals into the soil, and that prevents weeds from germinating. So, if you want to go through for weed suppression, you want to look at probably using some grass cover crops, some cereal cover crops. Also in the summer, if you're looking at attracting pollinators, buckwheat is really good cover crop that would attract a lot of pollinators, and also clovers are really good at attracting pollinators. So now, moving on to the next question, right? So you ask yourself, what cash crop am I going to put in after my cover crop? So you need to ask yourself, are you direct seeding your cover crop? And if you are, you want to stay away from high biomass cereal cover crops, right? And that's for obvious reasons. You have all that high biomass on the soil. One, it'll be difficult to direct seed. Two, it would cover up the soil and basically prevent germination. So if you're direct seeding, you want to stay away from basically using cereal cover crops. or just terminate or kill it a little earlier before it puts on a lot of biomass in the spring. Also, if you figure out, if you're transplanting instead of direct seeding, then weed suppression would be really good, right? So then if you're transplanting, then you can probably use a cereal rye or an oat or those cereal cover crops because it would give your transplant some early season advantage going up before the weeds eventually come up. So you need to ask yourself, am I going to transplant? Am I going to direct seed? And by asking yourself these questions, you can better tailor which cover crop you could grow in the fall. So now you want to establish your cover crop, right? So you need to figure out how you're going to plant your cover crop. Like I said earlier, you could direct seed it. And what that looks like is, in a backyard setting, you could just go out there, broadcast it. But what you'd want to do after you broadcast it is you want to rake it in, right? And the reason for raking it in is to ensure you get some good seed to soil contact. The more seed to soil contact you get, the better emergence and the better germination that you will get. Also, you want to prime your cover crop before you plant it, right? And what does prime mean? So basically, priming is you want to soak it in water or compost tea. So, and I told you guys I would tie it up in the end, right? So, this is the link between composting and cover cropping. Use compost tea to prime your cover crops. If you have small seeds, so like let's say clovers or brassicas, you could prime it for about or soak it for about 48 hours. 4 to 8 hours, sorry. If you have medium size seeds, sorry. You could use like annual rye or oats. You want to prime those for 12 to about 18 hours. If you have large seeds, like let's say peas or beans, you probably want to prime those about, a full day, about 24 hours. The main reason behind those, the seed sizes and the priming time is basically you want to get those seeds to imbibe a lot of that water. And what that is basically taking in that water, breaking that seed coat, and being able to start the germination process. Okay, so the last question you want to ask yourself is how are you going to terminate or kill that cover crop? And there are various ways of terminating your cover crop, right? Also, you might not even want to terminate your cover crop. If you remember, like I said earlier, if you have a living mulch, you could have it, while to suppress weeds or also give you some nitrogen between your rows, while you're still growing your cash crop. So, but if you do want to terminate your cover crop, especially in a backyard setting, mowing is the most mowing would be the quickest, easiest way to do it. Sometimes depends on the cover crop species that you're using. Also depends on the time you mow. You may also want to tarp it. So a best management practice is to mow and then tarp it. Put like a black plastic tarp on it for a couple of weeks to make sure that it dies down properly. Also, you could smash it down. So you could take like a T-post, smash it down, then tarp it. That would be able to kill it off. If you're more advanced, let's say you have a roller crimper, you could use that. If you have a little walk behind tiller, you could use that also. A lot of the brassicas like tillage radish automatically winter kill. So once we get a couple of days of freezing temperature, they would automatically die, so you wouldn't have to worry about them. Also, if you're planting like a spring oat, if you plant those in the fall, when the winter comes, it would automatically die. Lastly, if there's like nothing is terminating your cover crop, you could use chemically. I wouldn't suggest it, especially since you're in a backyard setting. But that's one other option you could get, some life Roundup at the store and spray it down. So as I close, I'm just gonna give you some examples of how we use some cover crops in some of my research. And a lot of this could, translate to a backyard setting, just on a smaller scale. So right here, you could see that this is cereal rye. And in the middle here, we have red clover. And what our rationale behind this is, we plant this in the fall, sorry. And then in the spring, what we would do is we would terminate it by, roller crimping it. And that's what you see here. And this residue, then we just transplant straight into there. So we had our seedlings and we just, we got a bulb transplanter and we just transplanted straight into there. Um, this would give us some weed suppression until our crop comes up and where it can form a canopy where it could basically fend for itself against weeds. Between our row, we have our clover that would, prevent any weeds from coming up. As you can see here, there's no weeds coming up. So that's one technique that we use when it comes to using a dying mulch here and also a living mulch here. Between the row, a living mulch and within the row, dying mulch. And that's kind of what it looks like. So we're growing some summer squash. You could see deep into the summer, our dying mulch is still suppressing some weeds. But it's not by itself because now our summer squash could put out, shade the ground basically and kind of fend itself against weeds. And also in between the season, so the red clover doesn't grow that tall. We mow it, so you could mow it if you want to. It would come back. It's very resilient, so you could mow it and it wouldn't die completely, and it would give you that weed suppression during the season. Sorry. So same type picture, but we did it a little different. So if you could see where we're gonna plant here, we're planting cantaloupe, I believe. Here we just tilled in between the row, and we're gonna just direct seed in there. So this is early season. This is what it looks like late season. Depend on what you put in there. You need to put a plant that is a crop that is competitive, or forms a nice good canopy before those weeds come in. So you could either use a dying mulch like in the past in the previous slide, or you could just till and do a direct seed into the ground, and also keeping between your rows with your cover crop as a living mulch. Okay, so just to wrap everything up, so what did we learn, right? So if we look at compost and cover crops, and I'm trying to put both of these together, so they both improve soil fertility, right? Cover crops, they help fix nitrogen in the soil. Also, compost adds organic matter and nutrients to the soil, right? So they both enhance soil fertility. They both also improve soil structure. So both cover crops and compost improve the soil structure by increasing the aggregation, right? So it increases the water filtration, also aeration, and basically leads to healthier root growth and better nutrient uptake by the plant. If we look at soil erosion, both cover crops and compost helps reduce soil erosion. And my favorite topic, weed suppression. Like I showed you, they are both capable of suppressing weeds. So with that, I don't know if I have any time left. I know I went a little bit over. Haley and Emily, I could take any questions, or this is my contact information. If anybody has any questions, you could give me a call or email me, and I'll try to get back. I'll try to answer.
Hey, Dwayne. So, thank you for all of that information. We do have some questions in the chat, and if you don't mind, usually I'll read them out to you. So, the first question was, can we add livestock manure, or should that be a separate pile? And that was about compost.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, it's you can add livestock manure in there, and that's mainly so the reason with the pet manure is basically for the biohazard risk, right? But because of the different diets of a livestock versus a pet, um, it's fine to add some manure in there.
Yeah, I think the only thing I know that if you're adding manure to a compost pile is you need to let it get up to, I think it's around 140 degrees.
To kill
um,
those, yeah.
to kill any pathogens. So
Yeah.
you need to be more actively managing that pile than just like throwing it in a heap and maybe not aerating it. Um, okay, we've got another question that's a little bit longer. I have a free compost bin. I think that's a Montgomery compost bin. That's basically a tube with holes in it for airflow. It rained recently and my compost got all wet. I plan to add a lot of cardboard and paper to soak up some of that moisture. But do you know how wet is too wet or and when it becomes moldy? How do I get rid of the mold?
So if it's dripping out, it's definitely too wet. Um, you'd want to keep on, turning it, putting it in somewhere, putting it in the sun where it could dry out a little bit, spreading it out so the sun could get in there and dry it off a little bit. Do you have anything you could add in there, Haley, for mold growth?
I just do I do more closed composting. Even if you have holes,
Hmm.
like I would just cover the top of your bin. It just makes things
Yeah.
easier. You can still end up with kind of overly wet compost. But yeah, like you said, like the more you can spread it out, if it's molding and really gross, like the better.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next question was, if we end up leaving for a year-long assignment and our compost, they're leaving, like potentially leaving their unfinished compost heap. Can we bury it somewhere in our yard for slower or no oxygen composting, or will it help enrich the soil? So I think they're kind of asking if they can sort of save their compost, if there's a way.
Yeah, no, once the process starts, it's gonna continue until it, basically finishes. If you
Right.
bury it, it will still get oxygen. It would just go a little slower, but it will still get oxygen in there.
Right. It might be hard for you to like dig up, and the
Yeah,
microbes in the soil are the same microbes that will break down the compost.
yeah.
So that process will.
Yeah, it will be
Um,
fine when you guys come back. You just have mature compost.
yeah, like compost doesn't get over mature. It loses nitrogen. But even like a pile of compost, once it's ready, it doesn't
Yeah,
really over mature.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so next question was, can you add paper to compost, especially shredded paper? Should I be concerned with the ink in the paper, especially using the compost in vegetable areas? This is a little bit tricky.
Yeah, yeah, depending on what type of,
There
is it like
are
newspaper or,
newspaper is like what we recommend.
yeah,
Yeah. I wouldn't, the other thing is like not all paper is just paper, right? Like newspaper
yeah, some of
is
them have
very
this
biodegradable, but magazine, like waxy
waxy
paper,
paper, yeah.
it's
Yeah,
not, eventually it will compost, but if there's like a plastic substance, that will not compost. So you'll still have a pile of compost, but it'll have like plastic
yeah,
particles.
you want to stay away from those like finished paper, like you said, like the one with the waxy.
Yeah, the fancier the paper,
Yeah,
probably the less compost friendly it is. And there are, I think, a lot of publications, especially like newspapers, those are like biodegradable or like soy inks, I think. But you might have to do some of your own research on this.
yeah.
Yeah. And if you're concerned, I would just skip it.
So yeah,
And
just leave it out.
yeah. Um, I have several different compost piles. What do you suggest to do with weeds? They have 1.3 acres, and there are a lot of noxious weeds that they pull out of the garden. They usually put them in the backyard garbage bag. Um, And so the noxious weeds include an evergreen vine.
So yeah, you would want to, one, it's hard to, I guess I would say you could cover it up. So you want to get rid of, because those weed seed is they're gonna get in there either through the air. That would most likely be how it's getting on there. So it's, transported in the air and landing on your compost pile. So you want to get rid of all those weed seed first and try to like put a cover, like a tarp or loose tarp or something like that over it to prevent them from you know, getting in there. But I would also, try to pull all of them out of there. Depends on the type of weed. You could, flip the pile. If it's at the bottom, that would kill it eventually. Um, yeah, but it all depends on the type of weed that you have and how they basically how they spread. So I probably need a little bit more information on that. But
Yeah,
yeah, I would say just keep on pulling them out, but you want to cover it to prevent any more weed seed from flowing and flying in there and landing on there.
I think with weeds, the best practice is just to, if you're really die hard about composting them, you could like compost them separately. But unless you're taking steps to monitor that your temperature is getting up high enough in the middle of the compost pile, because all those microorganisms do make a lot of heat in the middle of the pile. But if your weed seed is like on the surface, it's maybe not getting hot enough.
Hmm.
And, you know, I would err on the side of caution and just keep putting them in the garbage bags and um, letting them heat up that way. There was another question about are there any cover crops that would attract mosquito eaters?
No, I don't. Mosquito eaters. Maybe Emily could help on that, but I
I
don't
know
know. I'm not an
Emily had to
entomologist.
go. Um,
Yeah, I'm not an entomologist. I know cover crops attract, beneficial arthropods. I don't know if they eat mosquitoes, though. I know they eat, um, other sucking type insects that would suck on. So aphids, for example, but mosquitoes, I'm not too sure.
I don't know of anything that's gonna like bring in more bats per se, or trying to think, or dragonflies, but I think dragonflies don't really eat plants.
Yeah, yeah.
They do eat a lot of mosquitoes, but I would think a lot of the things that eat mosquitoes would probably have a carnivorous diet and not really be attracted by plants.
That's right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably, like I said, probably Emily. Emily would probably be better to
Yeah.
answer that question. But no, for me, I don't know any, basically.
There was a follow-up to this about egg cartons, if they can be composted. And I believe like the paper ones
Yeah,
can.
the paper ones, yep, not the waxy, not the. I know there's. I don't eat eggs, but I
Not the
remember they
styrofoam
like
one.
yeah the styrofoam no, but the carton ones, yeah, you can.
Yeah. I think like the manufacturers of like that recycled paper, I mean, it's a recycle. I think most of those egg cartons are already using a recycled paper product, and then they're trying to make it very biodegradable.
Yeah,
Okay, and then this is a small space grower. Are there cover crops that can be um, completely and easily removed for the growing season, but help the soil during the off season? So
yeah,
probably winter.
yeah. So there are a bunch of what I mentioned annuals. So they'll be easy, ish. Let me say easy-ish because I don't know if people say it said easy, but they'll be easier to get rid of. Mainly, you don't want them to go to seed. So, for example, you could use a crimson clover. It's pretty good. Um, you wouldn't want it to go to seed. Once you terminate it before it goes to seed, then it wouldn't reseed itself because it's an annual. Um, cereal rye also is a good one. Oats are good ones. They won't, they won't come back once you don't let them go to seed. Um, if you have issues, you want to stay away from perennials. So like red clover is a perennial. So you want to stay away from these because they will come back basically. Um, but yeah, any of those that I mentioned are pretty good at once you terminate them at the right time, they won't come back.
Then there was another question about if we have a list or could share Maryland native cover crops and the benefits of each, which
So the NESARE, Northeast SARE has a good book about the Mid-Atlantic cover crops. That
let me
would
see if I
be,
can find that.
yeah, that you could use cover crops. It's more a larger scale, but it can translate for backyards. Um, Also MDA, Maryland Department of Agriculture. There are cover crops, different types of cover crops, and these are more, large scale type cover crops, but um, they have a good breakdown of, cover crops and what they use for. Also, UMD, our extension website, we have one too.
But as
Um,
far as native species, I don't
yeah, I
know
don't
how
think there are
many.
any, yeah, they're not
Maybe
really
the
native.
clovers? Are the clovers native?
Maybe a white clover, I'm guessing, but
I think that one was introduced. The thing about cover crops is a lot of these were they were developed for, like large scale uses on farms
yeah,
and um I mean the target for a lot of farms is to like recover nutrients, not so much on native plants. So I'm not sure about that.
yeah, so yeah, native, no, but stuff that would work here, yes. So, um, yeah, there's a lot of, I'll probably try to get it and put it in the chat, but there are a lot of resources, even extension resources where it would have these cover crops and what you basically, what you want to use them for. Nitrogen
Mm.
rich soils, I mean, nitrogen fixation, weed suppression and whatever you would like to use them for and their
Right.
benefits.
Okay. There was just a comment that I knew the mosquito question was wishful thinking, but thanks anyway. Um, yeah, I think I got all of the questions. Um, I was trying to find that cover crops book, but I was just seeing one about I saw the managing cover crops profitably, which is maybe like not quite
Oh, okay, yeah, it's not quite, but it will have the benefits of it, but like you said, it's more large scale. It's not like a, you know, backyard part-time farming type thing. But again, it translates. So
We have a cover crops for gardeners page on the Home and Garden Information Center. I'm going to send that to
okay.
everybody before I end the meeting. Yeah, I think this page it's kind of more designed for
Government. Yep.
gardening. Yes, because a lot of the resources out there are for commercial farmers, but you know,
Right.
if it works on a commercial farm, it can also work in your garden.
Yeah.
Um,
Just got to scale it down a little bit and
exactly. Yeah.
know exactly um, how you're going to terminate it, like I said.
Right. The termination part is really key because you don't need to have cover crops
Yeah,
gone
you don't want
wild.
it to turn you up. You don't want it to.
Like things like vetch can be a challenge. They're great nitrogen fixators. They get really big, but they they get they can be if you don't have a way to control them,
Yeah,
they
they
can
get
become a
weedy
weed.
pretty quickly. Yep. Yep.
Yes. So thank you all for coming. I think in 2 weeks, I think it might be me presenting, because I think we have a fruit talk coming up. I know we have a tomato talk at the end of the year and one other talk. Everybody that got an email about this will get an email about the next 3 talks, and that'll be our series. All right, thank you all for coming.